Okay, good afternoon. This is the final Philosophers Café in our winter series on what's justice got to do with it. And it's put on, sponsored here by the Chester Ronning Center, with David Goh and I and some few other people planning things. In fact, we're going into planning mode for the fall series of cafes, which I hope will be held right here again at the same usual time and place. So, for this final cafe, the topic is justice and future generations. And to animate our discussion, we've got Professor Jennifer Welchman from the philosophy department at the University of Alberta. Jennifer came to the department, she thinks about 1998, and has specialized in ethics, history of ethics, applied ethics, and in particular environmental ethics. So let me remind you that how our discussion goes. We will, Jennifer will speak for 15 or 20 minutes to put some issues before us. There's a handout that she has here. I hope everybody has one. And then we'll have a discussion which will continue to 12:15 to 12:30, sometime like that. We'll take a break for 15 or 20 minutes to refresh our drinks, and then come back for a final go-round, which will finish up around 3:30. So, let me present to you Professor Welchman.
Well, thank you very much. Is this working? Am I now? Should I lower it or? Yeah. How's that? Is that better? I have to come closer. Is that better? I know if I get too close to a mic, I start popping all my P's and hissing my S's, so I'm going to try to avoid doing that. Okay, well, I'm very glad that so many people came, and I'm going to be really interested to hear what you say. I'm currently working on a project in environmental ethics. I've got a grant from SSHRC to do a book specifically on environmental stewardship, which is a buzzword. Everybody says nowadays that we all ought to be stewards of the environment. But although people are happy to use this language, they often don't explain what they mean by it, what they think being a steward involves, why they think they should be a steward, when somebody's being a good steward and not being a good steward, and so forth. So this is what I'm trying to think about and ultimately going to try to write about. Now, one of the interesting things about these, is this still all right? I'm getting feedback now. Okay, so we're supposed to be good stewards of the environment. Sometimes people will say we're supposed to be doing this in part for present generations, but often the target of stewardship is supposed to be future generations. And it's treated as somehow obvious that we ought to be doing things for future generations. But for a philosopher, there's nothing more in need of questioning than whatever is obvious. So that's, of course, one of the things we want to think about. In fact, I'm teaching a seminar right now. We spent the first half of the seminar trying to figure out whether we have obligations to past generations. Now we're in the second half, we're trying to figure out if we could have any kinds of obligations, including obligations of justice to future generations. Seems obvious, but is it? And a lot of people will say no. But before we get into this sort of discussion, I'd like to have a case. It's always nice to have something concrete. And we have a nice convenient case going on right now, at least on the internet, if you've been following the debate about this. Some people here probably already know about a word of proposed changes to the Fisheries Act. And changes are supposed to possibly have something to do with us as Albertans, so perhaps we have a special reason to pay some attention to this. So a gentleman called Otto Langer, who is a former Department of Fisheries officer who used to be on the BC coast, but is now retired, had a friend of his in the DFO leak him a text of proposed changes to the Fisheries Act. So I put that on the handout so you can get an idea of what is being proposed. So at the top you'll see it says Section 35(1) of the Fisheries Act now states, and it leads off, no person shall carry on any work or undertaking that results in the harmful alteration, disruption, or destruction of fish habitat, and then goes on to talk about when you're not violating the act, again referring to fish habitat. So habitat would include, obviously not just the fish themselves, but any place in which the fish are living, in which they're spawning, in which young fish, and this would include shellfish as well, are sheltering early times in their lives before they're able to go out to sea or wherever they are. This can be small streams, it can be rivers like the North Saskatchewan, it can be marine environments as well, lakes and so forth. So pretty comprehensive. The proposed section, apparently, according to the document that was leaked to Otto Langer, and the minister has not actually denied that these changes are being considered, though they've refused to confirm it either, takes out the language about habitat. And you'll notice in the first line it says instead, no person shall carry on any work, undertaking, or activity other than fishing that results in an adverse effect on a fish of economic, cultural, or ecological value. And then goes on to explain what does and doesn't count as doing that. Now, as this was leaked right away onto a number of internet websites that people interested in the environment pay attention to, and that organizations like Greenpeace and so forth pay attention to, it got a lot of attention really, really quickly. And there were questions asked in Parliament about it. And to give you the other side, let me tell you something about what the minister had to say. The minister said, yes, they were in fact considering rewriting the act, and here was his reason for thinking that the act as it now stands is too comprehensive. Mr. Speaker, current fisheries policies go well beyond what is required to protect fish and fish habitat. I can give some examples of that. Last year in Saskatchewan, a long-running country jamboree was nearly canceled after newly flooded fields were deemed fish habitat by fisheries officials. In Richelieu, application of rules blocked a farmer from draining his flooded field. These are in fact incidents that did happen. Now in the first incident, the jamboree did in fact go ahead. The second incident involving farmers being denied permission to pump water off their fields, this is what a DFO officer from the local office said. He said, well, in this instance, the farm in the Craven area is basically a floodplain. It doesn't flood every year, but when it does, fish take advantage of it. There were hundreds of thousands of young fish, mostly pike and walleye, in there when they turned on the pumps. So he claimed the DFO responded appropriately by ordering the pumping stopped. And the office was surprised when Ashfield stepped in with a ministerial order to permit the pumping to go ahead, even though it might harm fish. So why is the DFO doing this? I mean, perhaps they are concerned about incidents like this, but it's unlikely that they would be trying to change the Fisheries Act just because they're concerned about some country fairs or a few farmers, I'm afraid. And the suggestion is the main reason for concern about changing the Fisheries Act actually has to do with oil sands in Alberta. One of the pipeline projects, as you know, is expected to go towards BC, eventually lead to a deep water port that would allow the shipping of bitumen to Asia. That pipeline will have to go over innumerable small streams, bogs, swamps, and so forth. And then, of course, when they create the deep water port, fish habitat again. So the thinking is that a primary motivation for revising the Act, not to say that there may not also be other very good reasons to do so, but that a primary reason for removing the language about habitat and referring simply to actual fish that you can identify harm to is that it would simplify the environmental process, the environmental assessment process, and allow them to get approvals for these pipeline projects faster. I don't know if that's true, but that has been proposed. Okay, there was a pretty immediate response to this, as I mentioned, including one of the responses was a letter from over 600 scientists protesting this. The lead-off signatory was somebody you probably heard of, David Schindler from the University of Alberta, suggesting that this was a bad idea, that it was important to protect habitat in order to protect fish, and often you needed to protect fish of no commercial value and their spawning grounds because other fish that are of commercial value eat them. And this letter brings us back to the topic, ended with this sentence: "It's critical that any changes do not jeopardize the environmental support system on which we and future generations live." So the appeal is to future generations. Obviously, we must have some obligations to future generations, and if this could harm their interests in the future, that would be a reason not to do it. And if you look at the second side of your handout, to give you an example of some of the petitions that immediately began to be created, and I put something over it. I'm not trying to make you sign this petition. You can do so. There are plenty of them online if you're interested. But this one came from Finn Donnelly's office. He's NDP, I think, MP from British Columbia. And his riding is on the coastline, so he has special interests here. He put this on his website and was trying to get signatories. And you'll notice in the last bulleted item, under "We, the undersigned citizens of Canada, draw attention to the House of Commons to the following." The last one is again, "Whereas it's critical that any changes to the Fisheries Act do not jeopardize the ecosystems on which we and future generations depend, simply to provide short-term profit for a few." Okay, so here's the kind of case where appeals to future generations get made. Because in the short run, removing protections for fish habitat would affect a few people locally. The closer again, okay, sorry. I can't get too much closer. The more significant impact is likely to be longer term, take many generations to emerge, and then be more systemic. We might see certain fish stocks collapse, or see collapse of other populations that depend on certain kinds of fish, or other species that just happen to live in the habitat that would be protected if we were protecting it for the fish. Could be that we're protecting things as a spin-off without even being aware that we're doing so. So this is an example of these kind of big, long-term, multi-generational kinds of issues where it isn't clear that there's harm happening now to real existing people that we can avert in any particular way by making a sacrifice of economic opportunities for development. It's a long-term problem where the real impact is likely to be felt after we're all gone, and maybe even after our children are gone, or even, in some cases, depending on the issue, it could be our grandchildren. So the future generations we're talking about here aren't our children, a generation with whom we overlap necessarily, or our grandchildren, or even great children. It may be a generation so far forward we will never know them and they will never know us. They're not real people now. They're not, they're not children now. What moral weight should that appeal to those future generations have for us here and now, real existing people? They're not real existing people, and they might never exist. All sorts of things could prevent them from existing. So some people think the answer is the appeal is really incoherent. It sort of sounds nice, and if by future generation we just think of our children, okay, that's meaningful. But beyond that, you really can't make a meaningful appeal to future generations to provide a moral argument for doing something like signing the petition. So I gave you a list of some of the kinds of reasons that have been given that we've been discussing in class, my students and I, for why it might be that it doesn't make sense to say we could have obligations of justice or anything else, specifically to future generations. Now that's not to say you couldn't have other obligations. Some people believe we have obligations to, protect creation, but that's owed to God. So no future generations issue there. God is there, or God isn't there, depending on what your beliefs are. But he's not in the future, he's there now. If you don't believe in God, that's of course irrelevant. Some people who believe in God don't believe we have a duty to protect creation anyway, so there again, anyway, that's a separate sort of matter from the question of specifically whether merely possible future generations warrant our moral concern now. So some people say no, they don't. And one reason is the first one here, that they're merely possible people. They may possibly someday exist, they may possibly have rights, they may possibly have welfare interests that our acts could affect for the better or worse, but they're not here and in existence now. We can't assign them any rights. They don't have rights. If they don't have rights that can be violated, we can't wrong them, we can't be unjust to them. You know, it's all empty talk. Related to that, justice demands we make fair exchanges with people. But we can't exchange anything with distant future people. We could try to leave them something, but they can't return anything to us. And if justice has to do with exchanges, then the notion of justice doesn't apply here at all. A third is an appeal to uncertainty about the nature of future generations. We don't know what they'll want, let's say 100 years from now. What will those people want or need? We can't be sure. And so it might turn out that in doing things to try to satisfy or assist them in fulfilling their needs and interests, we just waste our efforts. I mean, imagine if we'd been sitting in a place like this without an electrical microphone in, say, 1820, worrying about future generations and wondering if we ought to ban whaling in order to make sure that they would have access to whale oil to light their homes. Well, it might have been good if we'd done that, but it wouldn't. What would be good about it wouldn't be that we made sure they had whale oil to light their homes. You know, we don't need that. If they'd done it for some other reasons, there would have been a payoff, but that particular effort would have been wasted. We might even make things worse. You know, in our efforts to assure that they get something that they don't need 100 years from now, we sacrifice something that it turns out they will need. So many people make these kinds of appeals to our uncertainties about needs and interests of future people, to say that we should really not assign a lot of credence to claims that we should do things for very distant people unless it will also benefit people in the short term. And then finally, well, not finally, another is real people need economic opportunities right now. We should put their interests ahead of merely possible interests of possible future people. After all, if they're not going to live for 100 years, we've got time to figure out how to help them. But we've got people, you know, in Alberta and around the country right now who are in not doing well, and greater economic opportunities would be opportunities for them. And the resources we could get from taxes and royalty payments could be funneled towards them. We've got a lot of people on First Nations reserves in this province living with perpetual boil water advisories because they don't have good enough water supplies, as some of you probably know. Okay, now finally, and this is the one philosophers really like. We call it the non-identity problem. So it goes like this. We can't help or harm distant future people, say people are 100 years off, because of different governmental policies will result in different people being born in the future. Consequently, whatever policy we choose will bring a different population into being. We won't make one group better or worse off. We'll just make for different people. So let me explain that. So say we think future generations will need good fish stocks. Fish is an important source of protein. They'll need other things that fish habitat provide them. So in order to make them better off, we go the route of keeping the habitat language in there. That delays all sorts of development all around the country, including development of the pipeline here, in order to help those distant future people. But what will we really have achieved? Well, by changing development opportunities, we're going to change who meets who marries who gets pregnant, who gets born. And you don't have to change these things by very much when you think about it to change who gets born. All you have to do is delay somebody coming into the province and meeting the person they will marry by a month. Or they don't come because there isn't as much economic opportunity in Alberta. And it isn't just going to be in Alberta, it's going to be all over. There are going to be these little changes as a result of the policy that will result in different people being born. And then those people will marry and meet and produce different people, and it'll just spread outward and ripple outward until within maybe 100 years, it might only take 100 years, we could have a completely different set of people who are born than the people who would be born under the policy where we change the Fisheries Act and we have less fish. So we'd have this population or this population. We won't have made anybody better off, we'll have just brought different people into existence. And will that have helped the people who would otherwise have existed if we had gone ahead and done as perhaps the minister wants? Well, they probably would have had good lives. You know, they would have had less fish, they would have had to adjust to whatever that involved. But they probably would have had good lives, lives worth living. So we've denied those people an opportunity to live by adopting a policy that produces a different group of people. Now maybe that different group of people is happier, and maybe that's a reason, just overall happiness. But we won't actually have made anybody better off. We'll just have made different people. So we call this the non-identity problem, because the two generations in the future following the different policies are not identical, they're different. And depending, then it raises interesting questions. If you really don't think being brought into existence is any sort of benefit to a person, you may not worry about it, but most of us who like our lives do think, you know, it is good to be brought into existence, and so, you know, this is something of a concern for us. So I gather the situation now is that you get some time to think about maybe which of these, maybe you'd like to address these particular topics, either why you think they're good reasons or why they're not, and we'll see what you come up with.
Yeah, usually people jump right on the bandwagon. Right.
I guess I'm going to jump on. Can you hear me through here? Okay. I'm going to jump on right away because I take a bit of an exception, in fact a fairly strong exception to the choice that you have made of using the environment as an example of what we may or may not do to harm future generations, because I think as far as the environment and the Fisheries Act and those, the future is now. It's not something that we can put off to make a decision on later on. It's something that's going to extremely affect future generations. My children, my grandchildren, how are they going to cope? Whether it comes from, say, a farmer, and I grew up on a farm, who drains a field so he gets more land to farm, and then, of course, the water table in the county goes down, or whether it's harming a fishery, or whether it's wanting to change the act so that it can make it easier for them to destroy the stream beds and so on as they go, whether it's cattle, allowing cattle to get their water from a stream and destroy that particular stream. There are all kinds of things that are happening. Whether we pave over a city and don't leave any place for water to get into the soil because it all runs into the river and then into the ocean. There are all kinds of things that we can do now, and you have to gather that I'm a very strong environmentalist and fairly well researched in a number of topics, including this one. So I don't like your choice of topic, I'll say that right up front, because I think there would have been better issues that you could have used to talk about future generations, because I think right now is where we're at, and we have to do something right now.
Did you want to respond?
Well, I agree with, the reason I'm doing this is in part because I am trying to write a book on the subject, so admittedly, that's selfish. The other is, I don't think those are the only things we should be concerned about passing on to future generations. Institutions, cultural institutions, other things matter. But there are differences. It is a lot easier, noticeably, to persuade people to adopt environmentally beneficial, you might say, policies when they can see some immediate advantage to their children and their grandchildren. But sometimes the challenges that you're up against aren't going to pay off in the near term. So you're going to be asking people to make sacrifices that will affect not only them but their children and maybe their grandchildren. And the real payoff is going to come a long way off. It isn't always the case, but it is sometimes the case. And in those cases, then you know, you want to be really confident that you've got a really strong way of appealing to people, because, and a range of different people. So one appeal may work for one person, but not work for another because they have a different sort of way of thinking about morality and what they owe people. So it's nice, it would be really nice to come up with a really knockdown set of different justifications for why people should take this seriously and why people should feel they have some obligation, including maybe obligations of justice to the distant future, bearing in mind that in a pluralistic society there's more than one point of view. So I'm looking for lots of arguments.
Just very briefly, I just think that if you give people the idea, or your students the idea that this is something that may happen in the future, because whether we choose to do something or not. Now, I think that's where it worries me, because I don't think you should be giving anybody the idea that this is something that's going to happen in the future. That's my main point.
I just want to chime in there. I'm afraid there are some problems which really the great effects are going to come quite a ways distant in the future. I mean, the greenhouse gas problem, for example, the effects of that are going to be felt mainly starting 50 years from now and then into future centuries. So,
but not water.
No, there's other problems which are very immediate. Anybody else want to chime in on the topic of whether we should be thinking about future generations at all, whether that's really an important consideration in lots of things rather than more immediate concerns? Otherwise, yes.
Yes, I would just like to say that I agree with you to the extent that we have no idea what future generations are going to be like. And because the human concept of what is and ought to be is so directly present related, you know, we take it for granted that there shouldn't be cruelty to animals. Well, that concept was unheard of, you know, 500 years ago. The idea, I think, is that human beings can't exist on this planet if the planet can't sustain life. Nothing can exist on this planet if there is no, you know, good air, water, etc. And so every single thing that we lose off this planet contributes to the degradation of the ecosystem of the environment. And so really, it's the future of the planet we should be talking about. You know, whether human beings survive on it will only be real if the planet exists as a habitable place.
Yeah, so that would be one way to try to come at that particular kind of line, that the uncertainty is being exaggerated by people who make these kinds of claims. So the whale oil example sort of sounds kind of nice, but that's sort of a rather peculiar case. Nobody can deny that people will need water in the future and they need it to be drinkable, and that they need uncontaminated, and that they need air to breathe, and they need arable land. So if all the topsoil washes into the sea, surely that's a disaster, no matter what those people want. So that would give us a baseline to begin to try to push back at that kind of argument. And then the next question is then how far can we push back? Okay, they'll need to breathe, they'll need food, they'll need water. Is that all they need? Would it be enough if we made sure we didn't lose all the topsoil, had a certain amount of fresh water, breathable air, and put a lot of money into the Alberta Heritage Fund so they could buy the technology they needed to fix up our mess? You know, would that be enough? Or do they need more? Do they need, for example, caribou? So some of my students wanted me to talk to you about caribou, and I'm sure plenty of you know about this. We have lots of little woodland caribou in the province, scattered in very small herds. Some of you will have heard about the Little Smoky herd because it's got a lot of tension. There are others. The biologists at the U of A aren't too sure that with the resources we have, we could even save all of them. Maybe we could if we made substantial sacrifices. But here's another option. We could just develop the areas where they live and we could put a bunch of them in zoos. And then we would have breeding stock in case people in the future wanted to reintroduce them somewhere. And we could do the same with the sage grouse, of which there are, I think, supposed to be about 20 left in the province. Do future generations need boreal caribou? Do they need sage grouse? And how do they need them? Do they need them to be in the foothills of Jasper and up north near the oil sands and around Wood Buffalo National Park and so forth? Do they need them there, or would it be okay if we kept a seed stock of these kinds of things? Do they need particular species? Do they need particular landscapes? Do they need to be able to see them as we see them? What else do they need? So that's a really interesting question. So we could start there, and where could we go? How could we say, yeah, they need these other things, and it would be wrong of us to deny them?
Biodiversity.
You've got a hand here.
Well,
I'm trying to get Martin to bring you in.
Keep it close. I'm concerned, are we really going to be smart enough to evolve the way we need to evolve to survive? I mean, it doesn't seem to me that human beings, as I know them today, are really smart enough to solve all these problems that we see in the future. Or is there going to be some way in which we evolve that allows us to solve those problems?
That's a very good question. I have no idea, but it's a good question to run against anybody who does the sort of technical fix. Yeah. Future generations will be clever. Let's just give them some money and resources. We'll put some money into the Heritage Fund. We'll let them work it out. You know, and maybe they would, but on the other hand, look at all the things we've screwed up. You know, maybe they won't, or they will, but it'll be too late for some things. But what kind of things then should we be trying to pass on? Now, I know you obviously, in a way I'm preaching to the choir, right? You all believe that we should do this, but you all have to talk, like I have to talk to people who don't believe that. So how do you persuade them? You know, appeal to their moral beliefs. And most people do believe we should not hurt other people, we should help other people. Which is why this appeal to future generations seems, on the surface anyway, so nice. It ought to work. And it does have some resonance, but when you push it, and somebody who's, you know, doesn't like the policy you're running, whatever it is going to push and raise these kinds of issues, how do we explain, no, they need that. Okay, so they need water, they need air, they need to be smarter than we are. I don't know if we can do that one.
Well, there's a lot of talk about needs, but I'm not sure that that's the right focus, because there are a lot of things we don't need that it's still very good for us to have. We don't need Jasper National Park. We could live without it. We could survive. And yet, it's a very nice thing to have. So when we're trying to define what it is we are thinking about allowing to future generations, I'm not sure that just focusing on needs may not be too narrow. And we should think in terms of the good, even if it isn't the necessary. Could I? There are many other points, but I think I'll stop there.
Okay. Others, should I, or should we let? Yeah.
I just want to say that I think that most of us now, we're all in agreement that we have an obligation, a moral obligation to look after future generations, but the converted that we speak about, us in this room, we are the minority, in my mind. Because I have talked to a lot of people, in my own family, you end up being the crazy in the room, you know. Most people don't want to give up what they have right now, or make a sacrifice and do without. Why sacrifice? We're not going to be around. It's a predominant kind of, I don't know, what's the word here? When failure of a human species, I think that, I'm losing my train here, but it's mostly, I think, that people are too selfish to do what is required, because like the First Lady did mention, it's now that everything should be done. I mean, they're not going to be a future generation if we keep on this path without doing things yesterday. The strong things to do, the hard work that has to be done. So that's just my comment.
I don't want to talk too much, but I just want to make one point. For my grandchildren, for example, I'm trying to, what's the term? I'm inculcating them with ideas about their environment and their future, taking them walks in the river valley, this kind of thing, but also trying to show them that they can use a little less water, they can take a 1-minute shower instead of a 5-minute shower, they can turn off lights when they leave the room. There are a lot of little things that young people can learn. And you know, this just scrapes the surface. There's dozens of things that I'm trying to get across to them, and I think their parents go along very well with it. So you don't have to make terrible sacrifices necessarily to make some kind of an impact.
Mm-hmm.
Your argument about future generations. One of the things that comes to mind is, when we teach our children, or when we try to behave civilly toward others, have good manners. We teach our children not to pull the legs off spiders, or do bad things to frogs. What we're trying to do is, in fact, to influence what it is to be a human being for now. And hopefully, by teaching our children, inculcating certain values, trying to teach them about what it means to be a human being. Now, it seems to me, even if we take the ecological example, if one, for instance, looks at, life forms like a fish or, the slimy stuff at the bottom of the ocean, whatever it may be, only as an economic or other entity, it's diminishing the notion of what it is to be human. And therefore, in future, the notion of, you're right, there would be a certain selection by thinking of things only economically. But in future, what is to prevent, and in fact it's already happened, are we not creating a future humanity that is constricted and that it itself is only seen in economic or other terms? And so the way I see it is that if there's the flaw in those, the arguments are that they're all sort of utilitarian. They're kind of mechanistic argument that in fact what we are trying to do, at any given time, is to create a humanity that we believe is worth the term of humanity, not a humanity that is seen in some kind of mechanistic, utilitarian way. Anyway, so there's something, that I see very dangerous in sort of not seeing. In other words, we are trying to influence the future. That's part of what human life is about.
So I think that, personally, I think this is a very good way to go. That we should, say, kind of, wait a minute, okay, we started with this uncertainty argument and said, we're not actually all that uncertain about some things that people are going to want and need, both in the future, and certainly some things they're going to need. Some basic resources, some basic opportunity in sort of utilitarian terms too, in that sense, to have enough to earn whatever they need to minimally make a living. But yeah, that is a really constricted notion of human life. And if the object is to ensure that that we not deny them the opportunity to have some sort of full human life, then they're going to need more than just what's minimally necessary to survive. And then we could think about what are the constituents of a good human life. One of them, could be recreation. There are governments in Europe where one of the things they try to guarantee people is a holiday a year, because they think that we need to get away from wherever our workaday lives are in some way, refresh the spirit, get a change, see things differently, have an opportunity to play. We're a very playful species. We play a lot longer than most other species do throughout our lives. So play is something that's important. There are other things that are important, aren't they, to a decent human life we would like to leave as a legacy. Maybe we need to appeal to pride here, not just to moral notions, but to pride in the legacy that we would leave. But beauty, surely, is another. Jasper National Park is beautiful, isn't it? And many other things are beautiful. Now, I'm from the coast, so I think a lot of other things are beautiful that perhaps some people don't. Like, I think salt marshes are great, including the really smelly ones that people tend to want to fill in and put houses on. So beauty differs, but wouldn't it be nice or better than nice to have a full human life? Don't we need some opportunities to discover what we find beautiful so that we can enjoy it? We'll differ in what that is, but if there aren't things in the world that can give us those experiences, wouldn't we be denying, that would be a pretty stingy looking legacy if we didn't leave any of those things. So we can leave recreation, beauty, other kinds of things that are part of a meaningful human life that we would not want to be guilty of denying people in the future. And yes, caring for other people, those kinds of traits, giving people opportunities to help one another. If we left people with such a hardscrabble life, nobody could ever help anybody than their own immediate family. We'd be denying them opportunities to become kind of full-fledged moral people. Presumably we value that. And there may be other things you can think of. So you said, yeah, beauty. Yeah. and the broad range of kinds of things there. And I'm sure you can think of other things that you would like, things that you've enjoyed in your life that have been important to you, that you think are part of, what it is to be a human, have a distinctively human kind of life, that we would want to make sure that they have the opportunity to have. We don't want to dictate to them how they're going to live their lives, but where we assure them what they need for that, those opportunities. And that'll take us, again, way beyond just minimal, basic survival needs. I think that's right.
Thank you. I see a danger. You got here? Hello?
Okay. Close to your mouth.
All right. So I see a danger. The danger is the question of whom can we trust to make the decision. Now there's this gentleman over here who has one idea which says so and so and so and so. You just told us about what we consider to be good. Somebody else mentioned what we consider to be good. But all of these things imply vested interest. Now, Mr. Harper said of the Kyoto thing that he wouldn't do anything with it unless India and China were included. India and China at the time, if you worked out their consumption of energy or pollution index per capita, was something like 1/200th of what ours is. Now, I don't think Mr. Harper didn't know what he was saying. I absolutely do not think that. So if he makes that decision, he knows what he's doing, he knows why he's doing it. If our government tomorrow guaranteed that everybody in Canada had so much money, $1,000 or $2,000 to go on a holiday, most of that money would go to the entrepreneurs who would find ways to take it. We've already been through that when we had the Industrial Revolution and we had washing machines. The idea was that people would have more time to read and to entertain themselves and so on. It's gone. The washing machines are still there. But all that time saved is not used for what we would like to do. So it is a matter of who makes the decision and who has the power to execute that decision. And I don't know that it's very easy for anyone to say, yes, I know this person is to be in charge or this country is to be in charge. Take the case of nuclear weapons. Who makes the decision as to who should and who should not have nuclear weapons? People with the nuclear weapons. That was true of the people with cannon. They decided how far was their property line, depending on how far their cannon could shoot, and so on and so on. We haven't changed. We still do that. In the future, there might be 2 other nations that will be powerful enough to make these decisions. They won't see the same thing. Possibly they won't see. Hopefully they'll see something better than we can. So I think that is the more important thing to look at. How can we change ourselves? So the decisions we make are not selfish decisions, which somebody mentioned already. It's too big a field to include all of these things. I wonder what you think of that way of looking at it.
Well, yeah, you're raising real problems, and they're not problems individuals can easily solve because they have to do with how collective decision-making gets made. So some people will say we need more participatory democracy, we need to support those kinds of institutions. They'll give you a political argument. Other people will say that what we need to do is actually focus in on our children and raise them to be the right sort of citizens who will not permit certain sorts of things to happen through their collective agency. So we could focus on the institutions or we could focus on the people, or both. People control institutions, so if we can create, you know, a suitable electorate, suitable people of good moral character, that they will exercise control of the institutions, or we could focus on the institutions, or try to do both. I don't have a recipe, certainly, but you're right, those are real challenges. And particularly if we're going to, I think something that enters into a lot of the reasons why people do sometimes balk, and it's not just selfishness, at being asked to make, they and their families to make sacrifices in some areas, give up economic opportunities that are going to, in theory, benefit others, or perhaps more generally 20 or 30 years hence. It isn't just selfishness or a particular partiality of their families, it is a lack of trust, often in what will actually come. I will make these sacrifices, what actually will happen. Which is why it's always easier if they're going to see something here and now happen immediately. If it's a case of an environmental problem, it's something local where you can get some local benefits fairly quickly. Or if it's some other kind of problem, we refrain from doing this and we get a park. We refrain from doing that, we get some other resources for something else. That's really easy because we don't have to trust as much. And when it's something where the payoff is much longer term, and particularly if we're not even going to be there personally, then a lot of trust has to be, displayed towards whoever is going to make those decisions. And so I think trust is, I don't think we should, yeah, people are selfish. Yeah, people tend to be often just narrow. It's not that they're completely selfish. They love their children and their families, but they don't think much beyond that. But often, people are not selfish, can think beyond their families, but they're not sure who they can trust to act for them in these circumstances. And I think that is a really big issue. It's one of the compounding features. And these big collective kinds of problems where we have to be able to trust in institutions so that we can work effectively through them collectively. That's where this really matters. But I can't solve it. Maybe you can.
Another approach seems to me to consider decisions and actions that have been taken in past generations, in fact way back many generations, and how these have impacted on our ability to survive and to have a quality of life, whether it has enriched or diminished us. But surely our life, just for example, we don't enjoy whatever semblance of democracy we have simply because we have decided to have that. It's because of decisions made in past generations. So the argument from history seems to me to be very relevant as we think about our relation to future generations.
Yeah, I think this is one of the reasons I wanted to do, in the course I was teaching, I wanted to start with thinking about our relationship to the past. Because as you say, so much that's good in our lives is a result of things that other people did for us. Now, some bad things are in our lives because they didn't only do good things. But we've all gained a lot. Institutions, educational institutions, democracy. Jasper National Park, although admittedly it was created in part by the railways to get, create hotels so they get business out there. Still, other motives were involved as well. And the parks are wonderful. Wonderful, wonderful things. And so we have a lot to be grateful and loyal to. It's backward looking. But how do we pay that back? Of course, we can't directly thank or pay back the people who are responsible because they're gone. But one way that we can do that in part, that's consistent with what they wanted to benefit future people, is that we can kind of repay that by trying to maintain those things into the future. So the parks weren't created just, by those who were altruistic, just for our generation, and then we burn them up or something. They were created sort of in perpetuity, and we've benefited, so gratitude and loyalty would seem to suggest we should try to continue them. And the better institutions that have been passed on to us at least, like education, libraries, and democracy, and maybe not some of the others that we would like to eradicate, where we don't think we have any reason to be grateful for them. But there are a lot of things like that. I mean, so much in our lives would not be but for the often, quite altruistic efforts of other people. So I think that gives us a further reason, and we will want our children to be grateful and our grandchildren to be grateful for the things they've received from people who went before them. And we need to then educate them to have that. But they're not going to take us at our word unless we are behaving gratefully and loyally ourselves, right? If we just talk, if it's just do as I say, not as I do, it's not going to be very influential. So we need to act gratefully and with loyalty to those values that have been passed on that we think are important. And some of those values were things like people should do things for their community. People should care about Canada as a whole and the world as a whole, not just themselves, their families, their own immediate towns, that they should take a broader interest. And where we've benefited from that, then out of grateful, we can pay it forward, as they say. That's one way to reciprocate. So that's another area we can draw on, I think.
Just a question there, but suppose we were to be landing in a new world and building up civilization from scratch, so to speak. Don't you think that we would still feel that we ought to be building something that was a permanent legacy to hand on to future generations? Or, I mean, what I'm wondering here, does the feeling that we're under some sort of moral obligation to prepare something which will be of permanent use and good to the future generations, depends on our looking backward and saying, well, this was given to us, and so it's like a precious thing which we're supposed to hand on. Wouldn't it still be there even if that wasn't the case?
Good question. I'm not, in the first instance, sure how coming to a new world doesn't mean you haven't brought things with you. You probably didn't invent the language you're speaking, and you probably brought books and songs and other things, but okay, the legacy thing. So the legacy thing is interesting. My students, interestingly, all really like this idea that it's about leaving a legacy. There's an interesting feature to that. I don't think this is a bad kind of argument, but it's interestingly, it works differently than these other kinds of very moral appeals, so that people sort of make when they want to really take the moral high ground. So when you're thinking about a legacy is something you don't have to leave, right? You could, but you don't have to. And what are your reasons for leaving it? Well, it can sometimes be that you would like to actually help someone But a lot of people create legacies that involve putting their names on things, right? I mean, legacies are often about just making sure you'd like to think you were remembered for at least a little while after you were gone, that people took some notice of you, and if it's necessary to benefit people to get them to do it, well, gosh, you'll do that. Or you figure people will remember you for a while anyway, and you would like them to remember you kindly. And so you try to make sure that any debts you had, you pay off, you know, settle up your affairs, that sort of thing. We would like to be remembered. We would like to be remembered in a kindly fashion. I see nothing wrong with appealing to that, you know, if it's going to help, you know, protect something I care about, I'll appeal to that. And it's probably, maybe it's very important, I don't know, maybe it's a central, not a need, but a human want to be able to do this. People often point to, you know, we're kind of unique species with this sense of our mortality, that people will live on past us, that the world isn't going to end when we die. But, you know, and we form desires and concerns about that. I mean, that's fundamental to the human condition. So one of the things people need to be able to do, or should be able to do to live a full human life, is leave a legacy. You know, we ought to actually, you know, encourage people to do that. But it's a little different from saying that, you know, the reason we should protect the fish habitat is to make sure that, you know, distant future generations will definitely have, you know, enhanced, what's a fish? Stocks of some particular fish. I can't think of anyone I want to mention. That seems to appeal to moral notions of obligations of justice or benefiting or respecting people. Whereas, here's an opportunity for you to leave a legacy is the sort of thing someone from the University of Alberta does when alumni come on campus. You know, it's different. You know, where is it? At least it seems. So some people think of that as really kind of just an appeal to pride. It's sort of sub-moral. It's not really moral. It might work, but it's not really. Shouldn't be in the moral, the ethicist, the environmental ethicist, you know, quiver. It's not an arrow you should pull out when you're trying to argue ethically.
Does anybody want to chime in on that?
Hi, I am going to share what I've been mulling into my head. And it seems to me that we are really sort of wasting our time because we're worrying about the future. We know nothing about, and most likely is not going to be there. How do I get there? Look back, say, on the last 300 years. For every improvement we have made in our own life, we have wrecked something else. Take the Industrial Revolution. We started slowly, carbon dioxide went up slowly, and now we're getting to the point where it's out of control. And you can take it back again to some other improvement. Like, for example, infant mortality has gone down. New generation continue increasing. You can look at something technological. The first car 100 years ago had 5 horsepower. Today, the most stupid car you can buy has probably got 100 horsepower. And if you take even, you know, a regular car and you throw it back 30 years ago, it would have been a fabulous sports car. So we have made many improvements, but always at a cost. But we still believe that we are going to find a technological fix which doesn't exist. Or at least we don't realize that it doesn't exist. We keep dreaming. So what we have to do is come back to ourselves and say, what can I do now, not tomorrow, not for some future generation that is going to be able to exist or not exist. If you look at in another context, I am sure if we blow ourselves up, rats, cockroaches, or something else will survive, and so life will go on. But we won't be there. And that's what I think should be our concern as a species. Not only we won't be there, but half of the other species that have taken 20,000 million year or whatever. And again, in the general, we are irrelevant because life will go on with us or without us. So what should we do? Maybe we should take it back to us. You know, do we need the kind of life we are leading? Probably not. I was reading an interesting book, and the lady was saying that, yeah, we go on marches, we save water, we change light bulbs, and that does us personally, gives us a feeling of doing something. But we are doing to it all. So where do we start again? I don't know.
Maybe we should join stored human genes, not the animals.
Well, yeah. So Stephen Jay Gould, who was a famous, he was a evolutionary biologist. He wrote articles. Some of you have perhaps read some of them. A lot of them have been collected in books that are popular, great, very interesting. He used to remind people at various times that if you look at us and our species and the things we're doing to the planet in the way that geologists do, we're a blip. The planet is going to survive us. We don't really need to worry about saving nature or the planet. It's really us who are at risk. We can drive ourselves into extinction sooner rather than later. Yes, exactly, the species we'll have wiped out won't be there, but other ones will appear. We're like a kind of slow-moving asteroid. There was an asteroid that had killed the dinosaurs. It came fairly fast. The human species since the Industrial Revolution is a sort of slow-moving one. And in part because they do, of course, take what we're doing to the planet very seriously. You know, there's this argument going on, and it's being seriously debated by geologists, that they should rename the geologic period that we're in right now, which is technically the Holocene, the most wholly new, and rename the period pretty much going back a few hundred years before the Industrial Revolution, the Anthropocene, because human beings have managed to change the kinds of meteorological and other weather patterns which are part of what gets picked up in these different geological distinctions, which typically relate to weather patterns and ice ages and so forth. So this we may find, having been born into the Holocene, you know, we may find pretty soon we are officially in the Anthropocene. So it does come back to us and future generations of our species. We certainly have the power to probably pretty well eliminate ourselves, drive ourselves into extinction sooner. But the planet will be here as long as the planet will be here. I mean, we won't change that. And we will not ever completely eliminate life on this planet. It'll just take a different form after we've done our worst and done it to ourselves as well. So we get back to future generations again. Do we think our species is worth working for and making some sacrifices for? Or is that whole project a waste? Or is it just pride? The only reason we think there should be future generations of our species living something like our lives is because of just a kind of arrogance about our lives. Leave that to you.
Thank you. I have faith in a higher power. I trust that higher power. I trust everyone in this room with my life right now, and I trust a younger generation that we are referring to. Unless I'm mistaken, I think that's Mr. Bill McLean, or not,
yeah,
in the cap.
Yes.
And it's Ed, Bill, and what a place to meet. So thank you for being here, all. I'd be very interested in, I see some young faces here with relatively few gray hairs, and these people are right beside me here. I'd be interested in hearing the student's solution, Professor, to this difficulty that we're in at this moment. And I really believe that the moment is all we have, with my personal losses, it's been accentuated that the moment is really very important. So why not choose optimism? And let's continue to go down fighting, Bill, together. Thank you.
Maybe you would like to say something about what your students think about these problems.
They're walking around banging their heads against walls right now. This is partly because I introduced them to the non-identity problem, which we mostly haven't been talking about. So being philosophically minded, they go for the toughest logical conundrum, at least some of them. And they're trying to figure out how they can construe forward-looking obligations without running up against that, where somebody can say, look, you're not making anyone better off, you're just making a different set of people, and it's really hard to compare the overall quality of their lives. Some of them are really got excited about talking about these backward-looking concerns that we were mentioning. The gratitude and loyalty can really matter. And that it's part of being a good person. Part of being a decent person is just having these traits in your character. And if you don't, how could you say you had them if you weren't concerned about passing on legacies from the past, and that related to the issues we were talking about, both environmental concerns and also talking about social and cultural institutions. And so a lot of them think that's really promising, that what we need to do is enrich our sense of ourselves as being located in a stream of generations that are interconnected in different kinds of ways, forward and backward. So they like thinking about that. Others think it's really hopeless to think about distant future at all. And so what we should do is concentrate on the near term. Human beings are better at making sense of how they should treat people who are real and are right in front of them than they are people who are very distant. It's easy to know that you should help someone who's been knocked down by a car in the street. It can be difficult to persuade yourself you should help someone to whom something like that's happened half a world away. So when it's face-to-face, it's easier. And when it's nearer in time, it's easier. So maybe what we should do is concentrate on our children. We overlap with that generation. Do our best for them. Try to raise them to raise their children in the right sort of way. So that we should just leave the distant future out of it, focus on the near term, and just figure that's how we're structured. Maybe it's too bad, but that's how we are. But work with that. And so concentrate on the generations we overlap with. The worry for some is that we'll leave some really big systemic problems maybe not getting sufficient attention because we're all focused on the more local ones where we see some benefit that will come at least to those we know, even if it comes to them after we're dead, but we know them or know they're likely to appear like our great-grandchildren. So that's another strategy. So they really want to do that, so we should be educating our children. So on that kind of line, I guess I'm trying to do that. I reluctantly, some of you will be horrified I was still using one, but I really did love my dryer. I really did love it. And I do still own it. It's still in the house, but it gets used now once, maybe if you average it up, it's once a month. It was really hard to give up and hang things up indoors. Okay, personal weakness of mine. But I thought my kids have to see something other than my signing petitions, which they don't see, or writing checks, and just using less water is nagging them. And just telling them to turn the lights out, which I do anyway because I'm a Connecticut Yankee and we don't believe in ever using anything you can do without. So I was already nagging. That's just nagging. So what can I do that's more concrete, and what should I probably do anyway? So stop using the dryer. And I'm sure it's doing something beneficial to our fuel bills, but they see that. My son was really horrified at first. He didn't really know what jeans, you'll all know because you're all old enough. You remember what jeans, particularly before stonewashed jeans, felt like when you put them on straight out of the wash? He never felt that ever in his life. And he did for the first time when I started hanging these things outside or inside. And he discovered what denim is really like, particularly if it isn't even stonewashed. So it was an education for him. That isn't huge, but it was something. So maybe I can convince them. But, really, there are better things we could do than things like that. They help somewhat, but as you said, it's a small thing. It would be much better if we could all convince ourselves to do work have to do, which is pay a hell of a lot more for our energy. Would you all go out? I mean, maybe you all would, but you know, if we could persuade people to vote for higher energy taxes, which is very hard. But, you know, people's carbon footprint in Europe is much smaller than ours. And it's not because we're nastier people and they're just better, more idealistic people. It's because it costs them more to run machinery. So they use it much more carefully. In standard, my husband and his family are English. Standard refrigerator in their homes is half the size of ours. That's just standard. You know, it's only people who do a lot of entertaining who have a really big one. Because for day-to-day needs, the half size will actually do, and it runs less electricity. But those things are hard.
But this raises the question of whether the Europeans are more interested in leaving something of permanent value for the future than people in North America.
Well, I don't know if that's why energy costs more. Maybe it.
Well, it's government policies then.
Yeah,
they tax a lot more than
yeah. Well, they have a different view of what makes a human life valuable, and they think often in social democracies that the state ought to make sure that you're getting some of that. So it includes holidays and different kinds of institutions sometimes. So we could go back to that, thinking about these kinds of things. I think ultimately it does have to come back to what makes a life valuable. I mean, it did save me time having a dryer. It would cost more. You'd be able to do less of some kinds of things if you couldn't afford to drive your car quite as often, or if you didn't put Christmas lights on, I don't know, at Christmas, various other things, ran some kinds of technologies less. On the other hand, the challenge might stimulate the younger folks to develop yet more energy efficient technologies, which has happened. A lot of much more energy efficient versions of other things, of things that we use, have come out of Europe because of the constraints, the economic constraints of the systems they're in.
I was thinking in terms of Europe, wouldn't a huge part of that also have to do with the population density they have?
Yeah.
And, you know, if you take a look at someplace like China or India, the City of Joy, I understand, in Mumbai, does not have many machines of any kind. And so, you know, in terms of our future generations, when you mentioned the possibility of looking further ahead, isn't one of the things we should be considering a world with maybe 20, 30 billion people? And what that will mean for future generations?
Yes, so do you want to talk about population policy? That's certainly a major driver of our environmental problems. And it also, I mean, it has this interesting dual effect. Yes, you force people to live in circumstances that many people find very constraining, dense cities and so forth. On the other hand, people who live in dense cities often have really, really small carbon footprints. So I remember a few years ago seeing a study that suggested New Yorkers might have about the lowest carbon footprint of anyone in North America. Why? Because of the way they live, packed in small spaces. They often don't own cars because there's less and less places to park them. I mean, obviously some people own cars. And there's increasingly constraints on that. London is starting to go that direction. There's more and more control of traffic and elimination of traffic from certain parts of the cities. So on the one hand, population would lead to more bigger cities. On the other hand, the cities have this lower impact. It would be nice if we could get that without having to actually overcrowd ourselves to drive ourselves to do it. And
were you suggesting that population control here might be a way of assisting future generations? I think that was the,
okay.
And that's a very interesting later.
That's the one I've been trying not to talk about. So I have a lot of friends in sort of environmental philosophy, sort of professional groups and so forth. And whenever we meet, that's, often population is first and foremost what they want to talk about and what they want to bring down. Not by going to the extremes of something like a China one-child policy, but by finding ways to encourage people to have fewer children by whatever means will work, short of that. Now, this raises some interesting issues because, if this sort of advice to the world, have fewer children, is coming from us, well, we live in a country where population is falling. Birth rates are falling. The only reason we sort of maintain overall growth of population is by immigration. And that's true of Western Europe and a lot of other Western countries. It's not true of the global South so much. Although there's some leveling in some countries, rates are still going up. So one of the reasons I have a lot of discomfort about this, although yes, it would certainly help stretch all the resources, particularly the non-renewable ones, but the renewables ones as well, into the future, if we had fewer people drawing them down. But I can't help feeling uncomfortable about being a white middle-class woman who's got her 2 kids in a comfortable country where this isn't really an issue, prescribing to parts of the world, because that's where the prescription really has to be. Get your population down, even if you don't want that right now, even if you have, this doesn't fit in with your culture, even though it doesn't fit in with what you see as your needs. But perhaps ultimately it does have to be that way. I mean, we have to do that. There may be good reasons in the present also to do that. I'd feel a lot more comfortable anytime that was the case. If people in the particular region would like to have fewer children, but they don't have access to enough birth control, then by all means let us go in there and do that. But there are areas and regions and cultures that people don't perceive a short-term need to change their family practices and their cultural practices significantly. And where other kinds of things that might help make them go for a smaller family are not in place. Social Security and so forth. The fact that we can all, this is part of being in this culture, when I retire, as when you do, or some of you have retired, you can count on other people's children to support you. You don't actually need any of your own. It's helpful, but you don't actually need them because you're drawing on other people. But in countries where there is no system like that, and where family is what you look to, asking people to take the risk of getting by with fewer children is asking them to take a big risk. So I agree. I mean, this is a big part of the issue. It would certainly help if we could find ways of helping cultures than our own where increasing population rates are still, they're really going up rapidly. They're not falling as they are here. If we could find ways consistent with respect for them and their circumstances to help them adopt methods they find acceptable to bring them down, I think that's great. Another possibility is we could just let lots of people immigrate here. Because then if they've got family members here sending money home, they don't need as many kids back home. I've suggested this frequently to my friends, particularly U.S. citizens, that this might be a way of helping take the pressure off in some areas. Why don't you just have an open border policy and let everybody who really needs to economically come? And they don't initially say, yeah, which I always think is interesting. Yeah, open borders, let's do that. But it might be a helpful solution. Again, a hard one for us, maybe.
Okay, anybody want to make a final comment before we take a break here? I just wanted to say that I found it a little odd to think of reducing the number in future generations, the number of people in future generations, as resulting from an obligation to future generations. Right? I mean, anyway, maybe there isn't a paradox there. So let us take a 15-20 minute break here, refresh our teas, and then we'll come back for wind-up discussion. I have a person here, if I can extract him from this conversation, who believes he can solve the non-identity problem. So here we go.
Well, yes, I've been thinking about the non-identity problem. And if you take one course of action, you have one generation in the future, and if you take another course of action, you give rise to a different group of people. And I think what Martin said made it even more interesting. If you take one course of action, you have a lot more people than if you take a population limitation course of action, you have fewer people in that different generation. And how can this be reconciled with the idea that we have to make sacrifices for some future generation? I think the answer is in the kind of possibilities that these generations have. It's not in the identity of the generations themselves. And given my choice, I'd rather have a smaller population, even a very much smaller population, who had a very rich set of possibilities for living and doing things, than to have a much larger group of people who are just getting along and had a rather poor individual prospect of quality of life. And so in that way, I think one can sideline the non-identity and make it irrelevant, and what you're looking at is the possibilities open to those different generations. Have I solved it, Martin?
You've done really well, actually. You've done exactly what the person who invented the problem, or at least gave it its name, Derek Parfit, suggested as the way to cope with it. Although you also, the thing is, it's how are you going to negotiate the repugnant conclusion, which you also got, actually. So the guy who proposed this said that this problem about long-term policies that are going to change the number of people who live, although you can also play it out in short-term-ish problems, like the case he introduces it with actually is Alma, a 14-year-old girl who is thinking that she'd like to make sure her parents will, I don't know, let her quit school or something. Let's make her 16. So she could get pregnant now. And you can imagine counseling Alma, this is a dumb idea, it's dumb for you, but it's also bad for the child. You know, it's not going to have as good a life as if you waited and had a child later. But of course, that child will be a different child. The child she could have now with the current boyfriend is not identical to the child she'll have 10 years hence. Okay, so he introduces with that and then goes on to future generations. So his solution is to say that since you can't talk about any particular person in the future generation as being better or worse because you've got two different ones, how can you reasonably choose between them? Well, by their overall happiness. So instead of focusing on making individuals better or worse, that's your metric, you just add up the totals. But then you've got another problem. If you just go for the total, I want to make the happiest generation possible, then what you should probably go for is a hugely overpopulated world where each individual person has this life that's a little bit better than not worth living. But there are so many of them that the total adds up to better than the other world that you describe, where there are fewer people, but the average happiness of each individual, you know, is much better. So that's the repugnant conclusion. If you're one kind of, they're called utilitarians often, you think you have to maximize total happiness for everybody, you'll get to the repugnant conclusion. Now there are other kinds of utilitarians who want to try to optimize for the average happiness so we get a lower number, but there are other conundrums you can raise about that. So Parfit actually concludes his book on quite a depressing note. None of these work. So yeah, there's a solution, but it gives you a different set of problems. So in a way, you know, pick your problem. You know, pick your approach, pick your problem. Parfit would think that was great. You know, you really just brilliantly analyzed the only optional strategy that we have, because we have to give up the person-affecting principles, what he calls the other ones. Now there are other people who've tried other sorts of things. So going back to Alma, and let's say she could have she could have Jack or she could have Jill. That's easier for me to remember. So she could have Jack or she could have Jill, and Jack and Jill are different children. Does she wrong anybody or do wrong, or is she being irresponsible towards anybody's interests if she gets pregnant now rather than waiting? So here's another suggestion by a philosopher, Rahul Kumar, who's at Queen's University. He said, look, forward-looking obligations are sometimes directly to a particular person, like I promise you I will come and wash your car tomorrow. Okay, that's forward, it's about the future, but I've made it directly to you. Okay, so I know who the obligation is owed to, and if I don't come and wash your car, you've legitimate expectations violated, I've wronged you, and maybe been unjust. But a lot of our other sort of future-oriented obligations don't seem to be like that. They seem to be that anybody who satisfies a description, the obligation is owed to. So anybody who fits in with a certain type. When I go out with my car to drive, I don't just owe it to all the people in this room not to drive drunk and knock you down with my car. I owe it to anybody who could be on the street at the time when I'm driving, either as a pedestrian or in another car. So the obligation is owed to anybody who fits in a particular class, not to particular individuals who I can identify. Now, we could think about Alma's obligations to her children in that way. She has obligations to anybody who will be a child of hers, to ensure that she has, taken reasonable steps to ensure that she can look after their interests. It doesn't matter that she doesn't know who the child is. It doesn't matter that different children would be born at different times. It just matters that to whomever is her child, she will have put into place the right sorts of things. Just as it doesn't matter that I know who I'll run down in my car if I'm driving drunk, or whether they even existed at the moment. Maybe it's somebody who was born on the street to some poor woman who couldn't make it to the hospital and just was born, just got into position to be hit by my car. And when I started the journey, they hadn't even been born yet. If we think in these terms, that our obligations to future generations are not to any particular offspring or distant offspring of ours, don't think that. We just think in terms of a class. There will be people who fall into this category. We don't know a lot of things about them, and we don't know who they are, but that doesn't matter. What should matter is just that we're always thinking about ensuring that we're doing whatever we should reasonably see ourselves as responsible for doing with regard to them, whatever that is, because we haven't decided that. That seems kind of nice. It seems, at least for the forward-looking part, it seems sort of allow you to say, well, if Alma doesn't take those steps, she's wronging her future children. And if I don't do that towards future generations, even if it means giving up my dryer, I'm wronging them. Although it still has this funny flip side that, with you, if I promise you to wash your car and I don't come and do it, you can come after me and say, hey, you wronged me. And maybe if a lot was riding on you having a clean car tomorrow, you could say, you owe me something for that, you owe me reparations. But it doesn't seem to be the case with Alma and Jack or Jill. I mean, if Jack gets born, she's wronged her child in the sense of not having been as responsible as she should and getting things into place for her to be a good parent. But still, Jack would only have been born if she was that irresponsible. It doesn't seem like he can complain about it. I mean, maybe her parents can complain, and they'll have good reason because they'll be doing a lot of the babysitting for Jack or doing, the other. So somebody could complain, but oddly, the person who's wronged can't complain. So that kind of fits with Martin's thing, that it seems kind of odd that maybe an obligation we should have towards future generations is to make sure there aren't too many of them. And yet, who would we have wronged if we did that? So these are various ways we've been discussing in class about how you might get around this. You could either reconstrue what it is to have an obligation that's kind of open-ended like that. Identity doesn't matter. Or you can just be a consequentialist and try to sort out the problems with the, the outcomes, and so you don't get the rebuttable conclusion. So a lot of people are doing that. That's getting in, the philosophical literature, tons of discussion. How can we make this work so nobody can run a nasty objection? And people are trying other things as well. But so, Derek, I think you were great. Gold star.
Let's ask Nick whether he does actually prefer this low population, idyllic civilization to the high population, but rather impoverished civilization, even if we could say that there was a greater agglomeration of happiness, use that term, in the latter.
Well, I have no hesitation, Martin, in preferring the low population, high satisfaction option. But if you ask me why, I might be in trouble. I'll take a shot at it, though, because I think that I'm looking at quality over quantity. And if utilitarianism that tries to measure X ounces of happiness over a population, I don't buy it. I think I'm much more concerned with having a small quantity of gold than a huge amount of lead.
Well, I'm not sure I want to go down to sort of measuring happiness anyway. But I would like to go to another, I think it's another direction. I'm thinking of sort of, the Kohlberg and the universal ethical principle, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. So in that context, the fact that I don't know the person to whom I'm going to do something in the future is really non-relevant. I don't know somebody who's walking down the street over there, but still, I shouldn't do something that would be harmful to them now. So all we're really talking about is the time difference. So, in some ways, there's the argument that's being made is because I don't know them, or they may never exist, that still doesn't give me a right now to do something to the ecology that would be harmful to them. And I'm wondering what your response to that is.
Well, yeah. So the thing that, say, Rahul, who suggested this line of argument that I was just describing, the open-ended sort of forward-looking obligations, he'd really pick up on what you said and the distinction you made, even though you didn't exactly highlight it, between wronging someone and harming them. So he would be prepared to accept that the non-identity problem does raise problems for talking about how you can actually harm or benefit future people. But he thinks it's a mistake to only look at that. We don't want to be, necessarily be too utilitarian and only focus on that. We should also consider that you can wrong people. You can wrong people even when you don't harm them. It can be, you can drive drunk home and make it and not kill anybody, but you've still arguably wronged every person you drove by and luckily didn't hit with your car, even though you didn't harm them. And there are other ways which you can harm people. You can wrong people. You can wrong people by telling them lies, telling lies about them behind their back, and if luckily nobody believes your lies, it doesn't harm them, but you still wrong them. So his way of thinking is that we should acknowledge that you can wrong someone without harming them. You can act wrongly towards a person even when you don't know who they are. And if we focus on that, bring that back into the discussion, then that may be all we need, even though we're not sure who we're helping and harming. If we can be sure we're acting wrongfully, that would be enough to make sense of the appeal that there is something wrong with how we would be behaving towards future generations if we took no account of the reasonable expectations anybody should be able to have of us, whether they know us or we know them or not, and that there are some kinds of reasonable expectations they could have. And then we have to get back to explaining what that is. But so you really had your finger right on it, Rubel would say. We need to talk about wronging, not just harming. That's crucial.
So you would say that we're not harming the future generation, although we're wronging it?
Well, it may be that, possibly, it may be that if you push the future generation far enough, it's the kind of systemic problem where the harm isn't, it's going to be so slow and incremental that nobody will really feel the impact until 150 years hence or 200 years hence. It may just be that we can't meaningfully talk about harming their interests for a whole cluster of reasons. We don't know who they are, we don't know exactly what their interests are, so on and so forth. But we could still meaningfully talk about wronging them, that they would have certain legitimate expectations of any predecessor generation, that it do certain things, or try to do those things, even if it fails, that it have a certain attitude towards them, that they are worthy of some respect from us, even though they don't know it exists. And that if we don't even try to have those attitudes, to do whatever those things are, then we have wronged them, even if accidentally we actually benefited them by doing something wrong, or we would have acted rightly towards them, even if unfortunately it turned out that something we tried to do for them didn't actually benefit them. So we can make this distinction. We can talk about legitimate expectations and wronging people without having to bring in harm talk.
Well, let me try again. What I was trying to get at is the temporal, is the time factor. So in other words, if I could put it this way, if I, let's say, dump arsenic into the Saskatchewan River up from the water intake for the city of Edmonton, I would wrong people in the city right now. Bad things would happen. Now, on the other hand, that's one scenario. Is it not equally bad for me to do that incrementally? So let's say I do it, but the impact will only be felt 150 years from now to people I don't know. The effect is harm or wronging, if you like, equally to people. So what I'm saying is the obligation to the future generations is no different than the obligation to people right now. Dumping the arsenic, just because I don't know them and they're people in the future, I'm still not practicing sort of the universal ethical principle in it.
Yeah. If it's a principle that requires you to that we can construe as prescribing a right way to treat people, and so we can see the golden rule that way. That's not tied directly to consequences. You're supposed to try to treat people as you'd like to be treated, not to actually generate, a particular result. That would be fine, and we would be really focusing on how you can wrong someone. You can wrong them by, not trying to not treating them as you would want to be treated. If we focused on harms, though, Parfit, anyway, would say the reason the two cases work in the way you're suggesting is because you're just one person. And what you do cannot alone, all by yourself, probably can't determine that those future people will be a different generation. So the future people who will live, if the only difference in your life is that you do or don't put the arsenic in the water, or another example that got talked about a lot was you create a bomb and plant it, under the legislature, and it goes off in 150 years and wipes out a lot of people. The people who will live in the future who will or won't be hurt by that bomb are probably the same people. It takes a bigger kind of change to make the future generations different. And if it isn't that kind of thing, it's probably the same people. So we could say both in that case you wronged and harmed those people in the future. And the temporal barrier won't make any difference, you're right. But he would claim it's because the identity is the same as well. Once we bring in an identity change, which tends to happen over time, then it gets trickier to talk about harming people. But maybe we don't need to talk about harming people, because the principle of the golden rule can be construed as a principle of how rightfully to think about another person, think of them as entitled to what you're entitled to, think about them, if you think you're entitled to respect, they're entitled to respect, and so forth. And so we don't have to worry about the harming talk. We could just focus on that.
It doesn't seem to me to make any difference. Suppose the person did do something which changed what people get to be born. I mean, it would just seem just as wrong and as harmful as it did before. It doesn't seem to me to change.
But just as wrong, Parker would say it isn't. Well, if you want to be a consequentialist and look at the totals, you could say it produces a world with more unhappiness in it. But that's where we won't look at the identity anymore, because we decided we couldn't do that, so we just looked at overall totals. But if you're not the sort of person who's happy with being a straightforward, utilitarian who always just looks at totals, and if you don't like the idea it would justify bringing about a world in which there are lots and lots of not very happy people because the total is higher, then probably there are other parts of your elements in your moral thinking other than just thinking about consequences. And why not focus on those? Why not bring them into the conversation?
I wonder if I could ask you to say a little bit more about that last part, those other elements. In the example you just used, if a person were to put a bomb under the legislature, I would be happy to say that they did wrong, even if they did it so poorly that the bomb could never go off. I'd be surprised if anybody disagreed with that. So what I just mean by that I want to distinguish between an act being wrong and an act being wrong because it harms or wrongs an assignable individual. So on that basis, I wonder if you would be willing to talk a little bit about ways in which current conduct could be wrong, but where we don't have to tie it to future generations. That is to say, we don't have to tie it to wrongs done to assignable future individuals at all. Just that it is wrong to waste certain scarce resources. Does that have any purchase for you?
I hope so, because it looks like a better way to go than focusing on harms, at least from a theoretical, philosophical point of view. It does require you to fill out what would be reasonable expectations for future generations to have of us, knowing all our foibles, So other people on the road have, in virtue of our current legislation and what we know about the effects of alcohol on drivers, certainly have a reasonable expectation I not drive drunk. For one thing, it's illegal, and it's, it is supremely, what's the right word? It shows an incredible disregard for other people, their interests in their lives. So we think evidently people are entitled to some regard for their lives and for at least when we can, not harming them, but also regard for their interests, sometimes helping them, sometimes having nothing to do with them and just leaving them alone. So if we can say what reasonable expectations future generations have, and then we can say that we're acting in ways that show we're disregarding that, then we're acting wrongly, even if luckily future generations were actually to benefit, just because we made some mistake about what their interests would be. So like that group of people who we imagine meeting here, 180 years ago or something, who are deciding whether to ban whaling because they think we might need whale oil to light our homes. Had they actually done that, would have done some good, and would have been something, we should applaud them for. They would have made a mistake about how it helped us. It would, in fact, have done us some good. Not the good they intended to do us, but that's irrelevant. They were concerned. They thought that we would have some reasonable expectations of them, that they not wholly disregard the effects of their acts on us, and that they would, I guess, if we think they perhaps inherited things from their predecessors, that we had a reason to think they would reciprocate by passing on to us, and could be something like that. We might bring that kind of line of reasoning in. Yeah. So
I think this is really going too far. I mean, it's too fanciful, but I can't resist asking. So if there were a resource that had a very specific use, and I had the sole use of it, and if I knew that the population was going to be wiped out before there would be any need of that, but if the population weren't wiped out, there would be a need for it subsequently, and I just waste it now, am I doing anything wrong? I think I am.
Well, you'd have to tell us more about the resource. Maybe you are. Maybe there's a substitute for it, or there's some compensation you could offer. I mean, that would depend. I don't know. This is like some of these cases you get where somebody decides that some particular artwork is, I'm trying to think of something that could be sort of irreplaceable. It could be an artwork. I remember a case that drove friends of mine who are art history students nuts from some years ago. So in early Christian communities used to keep their copies of whatever texts they had, that were Christian texts, and beautifully carved, sometimes ivory covers. It would have the parchment in between, and there would be these nicely carved covers, and this would sometimes be in a special box, because if you were in an area where being Christian was not okay, it had to all be movable. So ivory was a nice substance and fairly light compared to some other things, and they were beautifully carved, but often at the time they were carved with symbols that were just decorative symbols in the period, not necessarily deeply meaningful, by pagan, in the minds of later Christians who found them offensive. So there was a gentleman in Texas who was buying these things, spending enormous amounts of money to obtain quite ancient carved ivory covers of sacred texts, but what had been sacred texts and Christian texts, but because of the symbols, he thought they should be destroyed. So he was buying them and destroying them. I had a friend who particularly wanted to focus his research on these kinds of objects. This man was removing from the world, the small stock of such objects. Not very many of them have survived because there was persecution. A lot of them were destroyed when they were discovered, and others were lost later. So he certainly thought of that as a terrible loss, and many people in the art world thought, and I'm sure historians and archaeologists and others thought of this as a crime. This man was wronging them, even though they recognized under U.S. law he legitimately bought these things. He had a right to exercise freedom of religion if this came out of his religious. Nobody, said what he'd done was an illegal act, but they felt it was wrong. And people often have this attitude towards vandalism of some other kinds of really important cultural objects. And you can imagine, I think probably if somebody were to deliberately set fire to burn and sort of vandalize, some particularly, some landscape or some region you particularly enjoyed and admired, you might have a similar attitude. Well, in his case, that gentleman was not, he certainly knew other people would be sorry to see this thing gone. He thought he had overarching reasons that warranted the destruction of these things. I don't know how well-founded theologically they were, but so a lot of people were upset. But did he wrong them?
Did he do wrong?
Did he do wrong? Well, or did he do wrong? I don't know. I know a lot of people who thought he shouldn't, because I'm not sure that he acted from a kind of disregard that we would always in every circumstance think of as wrong. He thought something was more important than some people's aesthetic or historical interest in these objects, but that doesn't mean that he didn't care about them as people or, so forth and so on. So if in your case it's something like that, it might be regrettable but not wrong of you to keep this thing, whatever it is you've got, and use it up and let it go. On the other hand, if the motive is involved somehow, you're knowing that it's vital to people or it matters to people in some way, and you just don't care, about that at all. It's not that something higher outweighs that concern, but you just don't care about other people. Then I think we could say probably you were doing wrong.
Would it be just what I was asking with the question you answered quite clearly, I think, which was that the test of what a future, using the case of what future generations would think of us and what they might reasonably require of us, doesn't entail that they are themselves the victims of injustice in that. It's just a way of deciding what a reasonable duty to assign today would be.
Mm-hmm.
I like that a lot.
Good, then that's what I said.
Yes, that's what you said.
This discussion calls to my mind a powerful passage in the Hebrew Scriptures, which speaks of the intimate connection between each generation of the human species and other generations, preceding and succeeding, and it's where the prophet has the Creator saying, I'm trying to remember the exact words, visiting, on the one hand, the iniquity of the fathers upon the thousands of generations of their descendants, and conversely, the blessing from the right actions of the fathers to thousands of generations that follow. I mean, obviously.
Do you remember where that is?
Where it is? It's yes, it's in the book of Exodus. I believe it's actually part of the preamble to the Decalogue.
Oh.
So obviously, I'm a strong believer that the appeal to future generations, or the appeal to the obligation to future generations, should carry a lot of weight. Yeah.
Anybody else want to chime in on this? Yeah.
Thank you again. I'm looking at that sun on the picture, beautiful painting. The Edmonton Interfaith Council has the Golden Rule in the center, and the various faiths throughout the world. The sentence for each of these as to the meaning of this Golden Rule that has been brought up. And there will be a parliament, another parliament of world religions in Brussels, and then perhaps one here in Edmonton as an extension of this Edmonton Interfaith Council. I'm wondering in here, especially for those that haven't spoken, how important is it as a motivator in your belief system to have this Golden Rule as a tie-in with yourself and the people in here and future generations, but here and now, the gentleman in front of me here saying who will have the power to do this and who will enforce it. Are we going to appeal to a law system, the law of the land, to say that this is the right behavior, the legal branch of Canadian politics, or are we going to go to the higher power, no matter what the faith is, and the Golden Rule? Thank you.
Yeah, I wonder how much this reasonable expectation for future generations will have of us is something tied to the Golden Rule, that is, you're supposed to think what you would, if you were a future generation, what you would have earlier generations
have done, right? Is that the sort of test we should be using when it comes to thinking about, well, whether we're doing an injustice to future generations by what we're doing? That is, we should be putting ourselves in their place, so to speak, and thinking, what will they say about us? That is, I'm not quite sure how to put this. I mean, what will they think? Will they think those people reneged on some sort of moral duty, or what? I mean, is it that kind of argument which is supposed to be in place here?
This is one of the reasons that I think thinking about the environment is actually so interesting with regard to future generations, although, as you rightfully pointed out, many problems are very, very present, and it would be a mistake to imagine they only have future dimensions. We don't have a lot of problem when we're talking about something, I think, passing on our democracy, you know, or some kinds of institutions, because there we think previous generations not only created them, but there was a whole series of those generations who then, you know, sort of acquired an obligation to pass it forward and pass it forward and pass it forward. It's all modeled for us. So of course we should pass on our democracy, and of course we should pass on, you know, being, you know, everybody innocent before they're proven guilty, or everyone equal before the law, or all these things. That's all modeled for us in what's already been going on. The environment is different, because previous generations, much before ours, have not seen themselves as in a position to importantly affect the environment, except perhaps by ameliorating its rough edges, making it a little bit better, a little bit nicer, a little safer for human beings. Eliminate a few of the nasty wild beasts, shift a river a little bit, grow better plants. That was what people thought they could do. We're the first sort of overlapping set of generations, actually, to really have it in mind that we could do something, and we really are beginning to understand what we're doing and how we can make important changes. Nobody else did that really for us. I mean, they created some parks, you know. There are a few things like that, but when it comes to environmental resources, people have just been using them, you know. So now we're in a different place. When it comes to this particular kind of important thing, it isn't nicely modeled for us how we should determine what we should pass on or not. So we're the first generation to really have to try to, for the overlapping set of generations, to think this out. So we're going to have to try different models to see how it would work. But one way is certainly, yes, to put yourself in the position of someone 150 years ago and say, they didn't know anything about me, but they knew some things about what they had on the ground and how probably things would get used and what things were at risk of disappearing. What would it be reasonable for me to expect of them? And so that I can hold them at fault if they didn't at least try. Not at fault for failing necessarily, but at fault if they didn't at least try to, you know, think of that, have that much regard for people this far in the future. 1,000 years would be too far. I mean, there's just no way we could think in any coherent way, I think, about how people would live in 1,000 years. But, you know, 150 is probably not too far. Given what we know now, and what we're doing, and that the people 150 years hence won't be that much different than we are, at least biologically, they'll be pretty much the same. They'll have a number of the same institutions. They'll be living in the same planet. What would it be reasonable to expect? And maybe we can also use just distant people in our own time frame as some model for that. What does somebody in another part of the globe have reason to expect from me when I don't even know they exist? You know, just it's a basic level of regard. What does that require? And start from that. But specifically in relation to the environment, something that no generation has ever tried to pass on in any form to the next generation ever really before. I mean, that's really a post World War II phenomena, practically, with a few exceptions, like Muir and some other people who helped create national parks and so forth.
In the context of this discussion, I find it very interesting that we are ready and expect of our government to apologize to present generations for the actions of past generations, for example, Aboriginal people, Japanese, Chinese, etc. So past generations' actions or neglects of right action have obviously deeply impacted on future generations, the present generation, and they can't apologize, but we apologize in their behalf. So that speaks to this whole question.
Yeah, and so some people who are looking at these kinds of issues are actually also looking at apologizing. When that makes sense, when is the apology reasonable? And because you can actually run the non-identity problem on apologies as well. The people who are born as a result of the people who you're apologizing to, the descendants of those who were wronged in the past, would not have been born had it not been for the wrong. So we have to negotiate this. But yeah, I think that's a helpful way to think. What sorts of things do we think some apology is owed for those kinds of acts in the past, and where we take into account lack of information and beliefs that people came by that though wrong, they came by innocently, and we take all that to account, and yet we think still some apologies can be owed, and if the only one who can make the apology is a later generation, that's a good thing. Then presumably we think some basic kinds of considerations were being violated that people should have to any other person, whether they know anything about them at all. And those are the things. What would we feel we would owe an apology for in the future? Because it failed to show that kind of basic level of regard. So that could be a helpful, look at this apologizing practice that we're developing and project it into the future and see how that might inform our thinking.
But it even might be the case that, that you need to apologize for things that you did with good intentions, right? I mean, suppose that policies were carried out with perfectly good intentions with regard to the Aboriginal peoples of North America, but ended up having devastating effects. So you can't exactly say it's because they didn't show sufficient regard. I mean, they were very concerned about it, but they just had their heads screwed on wrong about what actually should be done.
Well, again, it might depend. We'd have to look at a particular case. Is it a case where the people they were doing this with or to agreed or not? I mean, if they agreed and went along with it, then definitely it did not show the disregard. In that case, the apology language, I think we'd interpret as expressing regret. We're really sorry that it worked out so badly. Like we're really sorry that deep plowing brought on the Dust Bowl. Scientists thought they were giving farmers good advice, and we're really sorry that happened. So sometimes when we use the word apology, we just mean an expression of regret. But if some of the things that were being done, like residential schools, were being done, yes, with the idea that this is going to make these people's lives better, but it was done over the objections of those people, then there's still grounds for the apology needing to have a further element, not just I regret that it happened, but people were wronged, and something more than just regret. Some sort of remorse should be owed by someone to them, even though I'm not actually the one responsible.
Any further comments, questions? All right, I think it's about time to close this. I hate to say it, our final session for the winter. But as I said at the beginning, we are in planning mode for the fall, and we'll be getting out to you if you just go on the running website, and we'll be sending out emails about what those plans are. Now,
I'd like you all to give Jennifer a round of applause. And once again, thanks to Steeps and his staff. All right, so I hope to see most of you, even all of you maybe, back in the fall when we announce the next schedule. Thank you.